Hey everyone, welcome back. David in History for the Ages here. So, one of the things I have loved doing when I teach history is using primary sources. I have a couple videos already explaining how to use primary sources, some of my favorite primary sources, and one that I use every semester is this book called The Prince by Machiavelli. One of the reasons I like primary sources is because it really forces students to learn, to think critically, to analyze, to look for biases, all these things that really make us better thinkers in life. And so, what I want to do in this short video here is just talk about the Prince a little bit, some of the highlights of it. Maybe you're a college student somewhere and you're like, oh, I got to read this thing, and maybe this will help you kind of give some basic understanding of it. Of course, you should still read the whole book, or treatise technically. One cool thing about this is you can find this for free. I'm going to actually leave a link. A lot of these sources are on the what's called the Gutenberg Library Press, where you just can go find a lot of older sources, free, full text. And I'll actually leave the link in the description, so if anybody wants it, you don't even have to pay for it. There are some translations that are a little easier to read than others, but I think overall it's something, if you give it to some time, you can kind of read through and understand what he's doing. So first of all, a little background on who is Machiavelli, and then talk about some of, I think, the more interesting points in it. So Machiavelli, he's from Florence, right? You see the years there where he was born, 1469, 1527. And the book was actually not published till after he died. He was involved in government affairs in Florence. And his motivation to write this was because Italy at the time was fragmented, right? Italy is going to be fragmented until really the 1800s. I have a lecture I cover on that too, when Italy finally becomes Italy. But he felt that because it was fragmented, it was being exploited by other people, and he wanted kind of unified Italy, and he's giving advice on how to make that happen if you are a ruler. One of the things we get is a word that we still use today, Machiavellian. I tell my students, you're important when your name becomes an adjective. So, what does Machiavellian mean? Well, when we think of the word Machiavellian, generally it kind of means this idea of underhanded or conniving, or kind of the ends justify the means thinking, and kind of finding little trickery ways to get what you want done. And so I want to kind of show you some of the ideas he talks about in The Prince. I'm not going to cover everything here. It would be like a 2 hour video if I covered everything here. But I'm going to give you some of the things that I think are most interesting as you read the story, or not the story, it's technically a treatise of The Prince. So let's go through some of the highlights here. So one of the core ideas is he focuses a lot on human nature. I usually assign this book around the same time period I'm talking about the Enlightenment, where people are talking about human nature and how people behave. And he shares a very similar, I think, idea of human nature to Hobbes. If you know anything about Thomas Hobbes, who talks about, people being animalistic and competitive with one another. And he's basically saying this is human nature. Human nature is that we're deceivers, we're fickle, we're greedy, and he kind of puts all of those things into his arguments on how people should behave. So one of the things that he talks about that I really enjoy is whether, if you're a ruler, is it better to be loved or to be feared? And this is one that always leads to a great discussion, because I ask my students, what would you rather be, feared or loved? And I always get kind of this mixed result. So Machiavelli says, ideally you'd like to be both, but if you can't be both, it's better to be feared than loved as a ruler. And his argument why it's better to be feared or loved as a ruler is because basically, when you're loved, people will love you as long as things are good. But the moment things turn bad, people will turn away from you, right? And so his idea is it is better to be feared because then you will stay in power longer. It's an interesting idea, of course, in terms of what's right and what's wrong in this. If you think of various rulers in history, some have been feared, some have been loved, some have been successful, one or the other. But again, his whole core idea here is that, when you're feared, even if you're loved, if you do great things and, everything's fine, but the economy turns down, then no one's going to love you anymore. But if you're feared, you'll be able to stay in power. So that's one of his core ideas. He does say another one is don't be hated. One of the ways you're hated, he said, is by taking away the patrimony of people, the property of people. And I remember one of the points he makes in his book, which is really stunning to me. He says, people will forget the loss of their father faster than the loss of their property. That, in other words, if your father is taken away from you, you will be less upset than if your property is taken away from you. And that's a pretty kind of, ruthless way of looking at things, that people care more about their property than their own family. And I ask my students, assuming you love your father, what would be more difficult for you? The government coming in and taking all your land and all your property, or the government taking your father and putting him in prison or even killing them? What would make you feel worse? And it's really interesting as students starts to think about it, especially at the time when he wrote it, or even today. If the government, let's say you had your home, and the government said, okay, you're going to use your father or lose your home. And a lot of students end up, when they actually think about it, struggle. And one of the things about Machiavelli is it oftentimes doesn't make us feel good reading it. Because, one of the things that I talk about is people don't want to admit this, but a lot of his ideas are accurate, and it makes us feel bad that they're accurate, right? Because it's like, who rather be feared than loved? But when you stop and you process and you think about it, you're probably a better chance to stay in power. Who rather, would you really rather lose your father that you love than your property? But, when people start to think about it, very often there are people who say, yeah, I might have to give that up because I care about my property and my kids and my future and all of that. So there's those kind of ideas in there. He says, don't be generous. If you're too generous as a ruler, then people will walk all over you. People will expect that generosity over and over again. And then if you do that too much, then, that's going to be a problem. Another one of his ideas is, if you strike an enemy, make sure you strike them to a point where they cannot give you revenge, right? So that's very Machiavellian. If you're going to hit somebody, hit them with such strength that they can't hit you back. So that's another one of his ideas there. Another topic he talks about is mercenaries. Just do not use mercenaries or auxiliaries, right? And when we talk about mercenaries, we're basically talking about hired guns, people who are foreigners, not your own army, using them to fight wars. And he's saying, not a good idea. And the answer to that is obviously why it's not a good idea. They're not loyal. They're loyal to you as long as, the money's coming in, right? When the money's gone, or if somebody gives them more money, they're not loyal to you. And they're actually, one of the things that I like that he does in his book, The Prince, is he uses historical examples to bring this in. So if you do read the whole document, you'll see all these ideas, but then he uses examples of history of when things happen. And then we see events after he wrote it that still kind of bring this into truth. For example, when you think of the U.S. Revolution, right, when the British used the Hessians, the Germans, to fight, they weren't so loyal to the British, right? And they didn't work out very well for the British. So we see, he uses examples from before he wrote it, but then we could use examples from after he wrote it to look for this and think about this as well. He talks about so many other ideas in here, and this I'm just kind of giving you a few of them, but one of the other core things I always like to talk about are his ideas, moral, immoral, or amoral. And that's kind of a discussion that's good to have if you're reading this as a student, or trying to think, what does this mean? Is he a moral person, an immoral person, or is it more amoral, right? Is he just calling things as it is? He talks about different ways to acquire land and different ways to acquire a principality, as he says. One of the things he says is, when you go in and you conquer areas, yeah, you want to probably, quote unquote, extinguish the family line. So pretty brutal. Basically, make sure the family line is gone. But then he says you don't want to impose your way of life on other people. That it's probably better to let them keep their customs and their traditions, and their way of life. So again, you kind of avoid being hated. So those are just a handful of the ideas that are in The Prince by Machiavelli. You could read it. If you have questions, if you've read it and you're like, oh, well, what are these other points, and you're trying to understand it better, feel free to leave some thoughts in the comments. But I just thought I'd kind of share this for kind of just a quick little intro to The Prince. All right, hope you found that interesting and helpful, maybe inspired you to read it, and learn a bit more about it. Please make sure you leave comments, like, share, all that good stuff, and have a great day, everyone. And I'll leave the links for my discussion on primary sources and the actual link to The Prince in the description. All right, everyone, have a great day. Bye.